Hey everybody, welcome to Transport Treehouse. My name is Russell Frost, and I am sort of the co-host of this little fun time. Think of me as the Fred Noonan to my co-host Chelsea Sexton's Amelia Earhart. I just hold the map and point. Chelsea, it's all yours.
I've decided it is now your mission to figure out how to fluster me out of the gate every single time. Yeah, I kind of had a feeling. Well, and it's been a few weeks because it's been kind of busy times, but last week the California governor made an announcement around banning all fossil fuels after 2035, and it's kind of sent all of our industry and half the world into a little bit of a kerfuffle. And since we keep getting asked, what does it mean? I thought we'd invite on my favorite policy expert, and as mostly our guests are, longtime co-conspirator for many years, Dean Taylor, who spent decades at Southern California Edison doing vehicle electrification for even longer than I have, and is much wiser at it, but with a specific focus on policy. And he retired a few years ago and is now a consultant and advisor and general gadfly and still a co-conspirator, but knows more about these topics than anybody else and more than I will ever know. So welcome, Dean. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here. Welcome.
I guess out of the gate, in your mind, how about this announcement? What does it mean?
Well, in some ways, it's not a surprise. For those of us who've been diving into this, CARB's been doing something called the Mobile Source Strategy update. They last did that about 5 years ago, so they had hinted at some of these before. So, and CARB, as everybody knows, loves regulations. So that's, how they do it. I think maybe what's a little surprising is that traditionally CARB has tended to have their regulations be a floor and allow plenty of room for some industry to really exceed. This seems to be kind of going in the opposite direction, like it's pushing the floor way, way high on this. So maybe that's a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit my take too. So on one hand, it doesn't seem like it's huge news because, those of us that are involved in the machinations of policy in California are used to the fact that many of the programs have been walking in this direction for quite some time. And so inevitably the automakers will scream about this, but it is not unlike CAFE in that they have been a part of some of this planning, and it's been years that we've been watching it coming. And so it's a little bit of both things could be true at the same time. But there have also been multiple executive orders. We had 1.5 million EVs by 2020 and then 5 million by 2025. And so yes, on its face, this does create a much more ambitious ramp, but it also uses lots of language of goal of 100% ZEV and where feasible. And it allows an extra 10 years for medium and heavy duty vehicles, except for drayage trucks, the ones that go from the port to downtown LA, a very specific type of vehicle. So yes, it's ambitious, but I sort of feel like we're going to keep slogging through the same sausage making process that we always have been when it comes to making CARB policy.
CARB in some ways was outflanked by all these other governments around the world that have announced these kind of bans.
Right.
And so you'd think that kind of thing would be coming from CARB first. So that may have played a factor. On the other hand, CARB, a lot of people don't realize the state government's been looking at 2050 and working backwards. How do we decarbonize just not only the transportation, but every other sector? So they've been doing some really deep decarbonization studies by a company called E3. In fact, E3 had contracts for the government of China and the government of India doing the same thing. So this idea of how to decarbonize society fully is not new. CARB has a big giant study with all the University of California, out to how to become fuel net neutral or emissions from vehicles. And that's results are now just starting to trickle in on that. If anything, what surprised me in this is that they did not use the word near zero emission or net zero or plug-in hybrid.
Yeah.
Whereas some of the things we saw, there was a workshop on the new Zev Mandate. They call it Advanced Clean Cars 2. So CARB last changed the Zev Mandate back in 2012. And now they're starting a workshop process. So by the end of next year, they will go to the board and change this. So that's how they would implement this executive order, is through these changes to the Zev Mandate. So maybe that's the difference between when you look at other parts of the world, like the United Kingdom or France or other places that have announced these ambitious goals, is that CARB has the ability to put real regulatory teeth behind this and enforcement and fines and all of that. Whereas the other programs that have been announced around the world tend to be more aspirational. It's probably a good thing. It probably motivates a lot of battery scientists and startups and others to do things. But when you start talking CARB, it's a whole different thing, because they will start, fining. The other states will probably latch onto this, and through the 177 process of the Clean Air Act, adopt the same mandate, whatever CARB adopts.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's been a reality too, that while CARB was not the first to announce sort of an ICE ban, as we've started to call them, none of them have been codified as extremely as the headline is. And they all end up having some flexibility for hybrids or plug-in hybrids or other renewable fuels or whatever. But let's take a step back a little bit, because to some degree, people know of the mandate, the one we popularized and who killed the electric car. But unless you're one of us wonks, most people don't really understand what it is, what it actually means, what's allowed, let alone the other programs that are the building blocks of what this will become. So let's start with the actual Zev mandate. Passed in 1990, originally had 2%, 5%, 10% goals through 2003, and has over the years kind of wholesale changed into a credit system with multiple tiers. So talk about what actually is allowed in that now, kind of how it works, because it's not a percentage of sales exactly.
So you reminded me of something. I've been wondering why there hasn't been any media on the 30th anniversary of the Zev mandate.
I know. There's
passed September 1990. So we should give ourselves a little media hoopla here that we're the breaking news story here, that 30-year anniversary of the Zev mandate.
Yes.
My boss at the time, supposedly, golfing with an executive at CARB, came up with the name Zev, zero emission vehicle.
So it's all his fault.
Yeah. I came up with the name plug-in hybrid, but they don't. CARB doesn't use that word too much. They usually call it near zero emission vehicle.
Yeah, but Zev is by far the more polarizing term, and it's been banned from advertising in parts of Europe because it's so polarizing.
The reason it's polarizing is because the upstream emissions,
right,
from the power plants. And so how could that be zero emission if you're having that? But on the other hand, if you have solar on your roof, you have power to make it a true zero emission vehicle. You could power all your miles, or you could even buy offsets or something like that.
Well, and it's also a classic example of a regulatory problem we often inflict on ourselves, is using a regulatory term in a public facing way. So a bunch of these things should never be used in advertising or public-facing conversations, and yet it inevitably happens, and then we have to deal with the fallout.
So in CARB speak, maybe we should define for the audience, a Zev can either be a battery electric vehicle or a fuel cell electric vehicle, or actually a combination of both of those, whereas a plug-in hybrid is considered something else.
Right.
It is allowed under the Zev mandate, or the Advanced Clean Cars program, as they like to call it now. But Chelsea's right. In most of the press releases, it's like a percentage of sales, like 15% of sales. But or they quote a single number of vehicles, like 3 million vehicles by 2030 or something like that. The reality is that the credit system is such that you can have a wide range, anywhere from in theory, 1.5 million to 4 million or maybe more. So that, and it really depends on the mix of cars that are out there. And the big surprise we all know is that the long range EVs came a lot sooner than anybody expected. They generate a whole lot more credits. So if you just look at what the Zev mandate would require, given all the long range EVs, it's a pretty low number. It's probably, in the 2 million range. But then there's a lot of over-compliance. Tesla's selling a lot of credits to other automakers. So, we'll see. Based on the Zev mandate, it easily could be in the 2-3 million range by 2030 as far as number of cars. Probably a lot less than people had expected.
Yeah, but in a nutshell, the way that it works is that each car that qualifies gets a certain number of credits. And today, only plug-in hybrids and hydrogen and EVs tend to qualify. But historically, there were periods of time when clean gas cars would get a percentage of credits, and regular gasoline-only hybrids would get some. And automakers were allowed to sell tons of Priuses or whatever and store up a lot of credits and bank them toward future use. And so there's been some opportunity to play favorites in terms of the programs that they like or the ones they think would be more popular in the market, or whatever sorts of internal automotive company strategy was in play. So long-range EVs get more credit than short-range EVs, obviously, and those that could refuel faster got more credit. And so there's a whole matrix of what gets what and why that is less straightforward, but every automaker has to achieve a total number of credits through this composite that roughly translates into X percentage of the sales they do in California. And the 2018 to 2025 period ramped from like 4.5% to I think 22% is the goal for 2025, which leaves us now around like the 9 to 10% range for 2020. That is the mix.
Yeah, there's also a cat and mouse game between regulated and regulator.
Right, always,
and
on
so
any topic.
That's one reason why it's such an extremely complex regulation, is you have a lot of that. There was a time when essentially glorified golf carts earned all these extra credits and created a huge credit glut. So they had to do something, to deal with that. And then also, there's generally a desire for a lot of flexibility to give automakers a lot of different ways of complying. And that's why, for example, plug-in hybrids are allowed. But
right.
Also the plug-in hybrids don't get near enough credit. It's not in proportion, for example, to the number of miles electrified. So for example, if a plug-in hybrid is able to do 90% of the miles electric, it doesn't get 90% of the credit of a battery EV. And so automakers look at that kind of details because they want to figure out what is the cheapest way to comply. What are the dollars per credit situation? So there's been a lot of that historically. And so that's one of the biggest surprises out of the governor's executive order, is no mention of the word plug-in hybrid in there at all.
Well, and that's a topic, because on one hand, there are, well, I'll say it, there have always been personal technological affinities among certain board members. And so we've seen some eras of that based on which board member likes which technology. And there's automaker lobbying, who of course have their own internal interests, but there's also flexibility for market's sake. And so something that you and I and others have been working on for quite some time is that sort of plug-in hybrid flexibility, based in the belief that EVs are great and some other renewable fuels are great too, but adding plug-in hybrids, which have a lot of technological and political common ground, will help move all of this forward faster than any of those things alone. But historically, and particularly in this Zev mandate, a 9-mile plug-in Prius has gotten the same credit as a 53-mile Volt, to say nothing of medium and heavy duty vehicles. So the fact that they're all sort of created equal in CARB's mind has been part of the challenge, and a only thinly veiled assertion as to why, say, the Volt plug-in hybrid was canceled, because why bother if they're not going to get very much credit for it, especially for a vehicle that is 90% electric for most people. So there's flexibility that's for lobbying sake, and there's flexibility that's more science-based and more market-based that we do want to try to preserve and encourage.
So CARB recently started changing that over in another regulation called the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation. You could think of that as a Zev mandate for truck manufacturers. And there they allowed the plug-in hybrids to earn anywhere from 10% of the credit of a battery electric truck all the way up to 75%. So it's a very progressive sliding scale. And that kind of program would be very interesting to see if it could go over into this new Advanced Clean Cars regulation that they're working on developing.
Yes. And in fairness, they had some provision for plug-in hybrids, but part of the Advanced Clean Truck rule was due to this group of people that tried to round up the data. There's universities and others involved that went to CARB and said, look, we get it, and we think that plug-in hybrids should have to prove it. They should have to show that they're actually being plugged in and driving the miles that they say they're driving, and potentially get extra credit after the fact if they can prove that they did more than it looks like they would do on paper. But, trying to prevent gaming while also allowing some flexibility is the balance that has happened on a lot of the advocates' part.
And last December, when they were adopting or hearing from staff on the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, one of the board members said something very interesting, that they should be allow more flexibility to the autos and allow the truck makers, allow them creativity to figure out how best to do it, to stimulate innovation on the part of the auto and truck makers.
Right.
And that's, I think, a common theme that you'll hear from industry is tell us what to do, but don't tell us how to do it. And so that's maybe, again, a little surprising in this statement on the part of in the executive order. Is it tends to get a little prescriptive on how is the best way to do it.
Right. Yeah, although executive orders are usually very headline driven, but also very basic. They don't tend to get into that much detail of how something should happen. It's just like, here's a goal, you guys make it happen. Is usually how it goes, regardless of who's doing them.
You're on mute, Russell.
It's probably better that way.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a question. I have a air conditioning vent right above me, and my mic would sound like that the whole show. So anyway, now that I'm not on mute, I guess what I'm wondering about is do you have any idea what the bias is against plugins? Now, 10 years ago, we might have said, well, it's a very reasonable bias. It's a gasoline engine. It's a partial, very small electrification effort. But we know, because we've seen stats from the existing plugins, that for the most part, they've been exceptionally successful at converting people into using electricity for the vast majority of their trips. So why would CARB lag behind that?
I think there's, getting into the weeds, there's kind of two kinds of plug-in hybrids. One is essentially where the engine almost never comes on, or only after the battery is depleted. The other is a blended plug-in hybrid where the engine is coming on much more frequently, going up a hill or hard accelerations. Those cause more NOx emissions, traditional air pollution emissions, than the other kind of plug-in hybrid. And so, for example, in the midterm review, CARB really went into detail on the problems. And those blended plug-in hybrids tend to have much lower ranges in the 10, 20, maybe 30 miles. When you get into your plug-in hybrids with higher ranges, let's say 40, 50, 60, or 100 miles, they don't have those problems. The technical term for it is high-powered cold starts. So you're having a cold start of the engine, on when you're doing a high power event on the car.
Yeah, and the other half of that is that there has historically been a belief, and in part substantiated, but mostly not, that plug-in hybrid drivers and buyers just aren't going to bother to plug them in. And for both of those reasons, from the data that's been found so far, the general proxy is the more electrified it is, the more likely people plug in. And that there were a fair number of folks who bought very lightly electrified plug-in hybrids in the beginning, primarily because it was the easiest way to stay in the HOV lane. So they transitioned from a regular hybrid that got HOV lane access, then bought the most basic plug-in hybrid that would keep them there, because hybrids are often. But as you walk up the X miles curve, the more likely they are to plug in. And on the blended aspect, a lot of that is software control. I mean, there's some that's how much power does the motor engine have, but a lot of it's just when do we choose to make that gas engine come on? And so we've seen automakers adjust that as well, so that, let's face it, the Prius Prime, if to use vehicles you're really familiar with, the Prius Prime is far more electrified, not just in miles, than the plug-in Prius, and the RAV Prime is that much more electrified as a result. So as you kind of walk up that range curve, there's also some proxy for how the electric motor is used relative to the gas engine. But the more miles involved, the more value that drivers and buyers perceive, the more likely they are to plug in. And so as some of that data has started to come out over the years, there's been some relaxing around that notion of, well, maybe we should reconsider plug-in hybrids. And Dan Sperling in particular, who's very well known at UC Davis, but also on the Air Resources Board, has started to adopt some of this thinking as well and encourage it, in that we should maybe be looking at what he calls e-miles versus just the propulsion system. So vehicles that have more of a propensity to do more things in electric mode should get more consideration. And especially when compared to a shorter range BEV, which actually may not be used as much, ironically, because people's range anxiety will cause them to substitute out for the second car more often. So it becomes a long range BEV question, which is fine, but a 300-mile range EV is going to be more expensive versus a decently electrified plug-in hybrid that people won't swap out as often and will actually do more electric miles than, say, a Leaf or something like that. So all of these things are in transition, but those of us that bother to weigh in on these things, we encourage much more a data-driven approach of, well, let's look at people, what they're actually doing. And something that I've noticed, I mean, in the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, I'm curious, Dean, it does a much more granular job of breaking out types of vehicles. And in part because it covers a lot. It covers Class 2B trucks through Class 8, but it also gets into school buses versus drayage trucks and much more specific applications. And I wonder if that too could be applied to the Advanced Clean Car side.
It could, and the Advanced Clean Trucks does cover an extremely wide range. There's almost, soon will be like 2 million vehicles in that category, and most of them are down, around what they call Class 2B or Class 3, which is around, 8,500 up to maybe 12,000 pounds gross vehicle weights.
Which still includes things that Rivian and things that we think about as like regular retail vehicles are also part of this Advanced Clean Trucks.
But only a few 100,000 are up in the Class 7, 8, the big, 18-wheeler trucks that most people think of. So, out of that 2 million universe. But on the other hand, there's over 25 million of the regular vehicles that are part of the Class 1 and Class 2A, which is, part of the Advanced Clean Cars, rule. So the other thing that's worth noting that's really interesting when you get into fleets is CARB is now working on a complement to the Advanced Clean Truck rule. They call it the Advanced Clean Fleet rule. And the idea there is to mandate the fleets to buy probably an equal number of vehicles as what is mandated under the Advanced Clean Trucks. And Advanced Clean Trucks, you can calculate all the way out to like 2040. Mm-hmm. So out of those 2 million, it's roughly around 500 to 600,000 will be zero emission or near zero emission, roughly, which is right around 25 to 30% of the vehicle fleet. Give you some idea of how aggressive they are. That's in the executive order, however, to have basically no 100% cumulative on-the-road fleet by 2045 for all these trucks that we're just now talking about. And except for drayage trucks, I don't know how the heck they're going to do that because it's not really a category. It's an application type of use. It isn't like a certain manufacturer only makes them. It's a very difficult application to go after the port trucks because those usually are traditionally where old internal combustion engine trucks go to die. They're second and third owner trucks, that are really very difficult to clean up or electrify, either one. You talked about technology advances that with plug-in hybrids, and it's true, you don't see very many of the 10 and 15 and even 20-mile range anymore. Most of the ones that are out there now are more in the 25, 30, 35-mile range. So similarly, just like with battery EVs, you saw there's hardly any anymore that are around 100-mile range. Everybody's gone up to well above 150 or much more, 300 or even more. So that same trend is happening. And Chelsea earlier referenced an advocacy group. She's a co-chair of that sends in letters called the Strong Plug-in Hybrid Coalition to try to get not just every plug-in hybrid rewarded, but to really focus on the best in class, those that could electrify
the more electrified ones,
50% of miles or even 90% of the miles, to really encourage those. And they've been around since day one. The data from UC Davis, which did data loggers, is showing like the second generation Volt is up at about 2/3 of its miles electrified. And the BMW did a type of plug-in hybrid in the i3 Rex, and it's probably up around 90% of miles electrified. It has 126 mile range plus a gasoline range extender engine in it. So just my point is that the strong plug-in hybrids have been around for a long time. There's more that are coming out. Karma Rivero has one, and some others are starting to come out as well.
Yeah, I'm actually, I mean, other than the credit system makes it obvious, I actually think Ford should do a good plug-in hybrid F-150 over a BEV if the choice were to be made. But Ford isn't so concerned with what people would like me think. Yeah, and just like the drayage trucks were separated out. So the executive order says all light duty vehicles by 2035, zero emission. All medium and heavy duty, you get 10 extra years to 2045, except for those port trucks, because they're shorter duty cycle, they have to also be in the 2035 category. And then there's a clean miles standard on the light duty side attempting to separate out use cases that really tries to address TNCs, Uber and Lyft drivers, and trying to get those companies to increase the penetration of EVs into their fleets.
CARB has a whole raft of other, mandates, including on, ships plugging in, and airport shuttles and transit buses, and forklifts are coming, and hovercraft rules. So they're even on small equipment and lawnmower type stuff. So they're going after almost everything they can possibly find. One interesting thing on the governor's executive order is the difference between requiring on-road new vehicles to be electrified versus the entire cumulative fleet to be electrified. So if you carefully read it, he uses both terms. So in the case of the light duty vehicles, the new sales have to start being electrified in 2035, 100%. But that leaves a lot of room for people to buy cars out of state, to hold on to their old cars, et cetera. So doesn't mean that gasoline cars are going to be going, away. Right. On the truck side, however, he uses different language, 100% of the entire fleet in 2045. So you would have to start new sales much sooner than that. And because you're also doing a fleet requirement on the fleets, you can force those turnovers through that one. So it might be, a little more possible. But, people, I'm reading some of the trade press, and like Sacramento Bee had a story, I think yesterday, just saying, people in rural areas are almost thinking this is a joke, how, right. And so that's one of our points of the Strong Plug-in Hybrid Coalition, is the need for looking at the bigger picture, that California's message is going to be heard around the world. So you need to think about rural areas, which have much different driving patterns, longer, total miles per year. You need to think about low-income people and disadvantaged communities. You need to think about cold weather areas. So all of these areas, if you have strong plug-in hybrids plus BEVs plus fuel cells, you'll get to the climate goals a whole lot faster.
Right.
Plus, people forget that there's emergencies. Dual fuel vehicles have a lot of advantages. So for example, if there's wildfires, if there's hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, riots, all of these things, especially the business community would like to see that kind of flexibility of having a backup mode. So these are some of the reasons, but not all of the reasons why we think that strong plug-in hybrids are a really great complement to what the governor's talking about.
Yeah, certainly the bi-directional power. I mean, we always call it V to G, but there's various sub-nuances to that, of being able to do vehicle to building or home in the case of cars, but also just exportable power on site for a municipal vehicle in the middle of an emergency. And even in these pandemic times, it's not so much of a propulsion issue, but it's been interesting to watch things like school buses go be parked in areas that have no Wi-Fi access, just to be Wi-Fi hotspots. We're repurposing features on vehicles in ways that would not have been imagined even 6 months ago, let alone in the longer term when we think about resilience and the degree to which relying on any particular one thing, even if we all love EVs, also leads to different unintended consequences.
Russell, maybe this would be a good time to show the slide we were going to show.
You got it. And I'm going to sneak in a question. So does the mandate that Newsom wrote or passed, the executive order, excuse me, does it mention anything about used vehicles?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Because that's
coincidentally, so you get the slide up, Russell, and coincidentally, I'll mention that this Advanced Clean Cars review process that Dean already mentioned has a bunch of proposals in it already. Staff gave a report or presented a deck a couple weeks ago at a workshop about this topic. And kind of for the first time that I've noticed, On the EV side, there are recommendations that are much more in the consumer protection class than CARB has ever done before. Usually their purview is really emissions only. And so where there's a battery warranty requirement on hybrids or plug-in hybrids, it's to ensure a specific emissions profile for 10 years. It's not really so much worried about the market being confident in the batteries. But now there are things like increased warranty requirements on having a publicly viewable, without a special tool, state of health reading that's available, which is, some of these are really specifically geared towards used vehicles and making sure that people looking at a used EV can tell without having to be, you know, a vehicle technician what the condition of that car is, and ensuring a very specific, you know, useful life period and things like that, that are more geared towards regular people and consumers, but also the used car market, which is not really CARB's thing. But and I mean, it is a fair question. Everyone looking at this mandate going, okay, fine, you're going to require all these things, but how do we make sure the market is ready for it and willing and feels confident, and all of those things that we've all been wrestling with for decades?
CARB, in their workshop on the advanced clean cars last week, had many of these other things in there, including the idea of requiring, like Europe does, that the only connector is the CCS connector, which would basically get rid of CHAdeMO and Tesla connectors. CARB surprisingly has that authority. They did that back in about 2005. Somebody who's unfortunately passed away, Craig Childers, spearheaded that effort. And it basically, back in that time, we had a long going war between paddle versus plug.
Inductive versus conductive. Yeah.
And they got rid of the conductive, the paddle charging as a way to, inductive, excuse me, to stimulate the industry. So, and CARB has a whole bunch of ideas on that. Maybe we should switch over to the slide. This is just a scenario. It was shown at the workshop on advanced clean cars. It comes from the upcoming mobile source strategy, which isn't out yet. And it's very similar to what the governor announced. And basically you see there under 2035, 100% ZEV plus PHEV sales. The difference is that the governor didn't mention PHEVs. Is the key difference here. So, but it does give you a sense, you know, of where we are now, which is, you know, about 730,000, you know, plug-in hybrids, battery EVs, and fuel cell vehicles. And so you see how the fuel cell vehicles are way behind. There's not very many of them, even in their projections out to 2030. The prior governor had a goal of 5 million ZEVs and plug-in hybrids by 2030. So you see here, there's this new number of 8 million, which is the first time we've seen such a big number. I think that surprised a few people. And then the little asterisk saying 28% of the on-road fleet. So the rest in the dark blue are all traditional hybrids and regular traditional cars. And the green or aqua kind of color there is the plug-in hybrid amounts. So you see the BEVs growing to be the really large numbers and going out to, you know, 85% of the on-road fleet. And I did some back of the envelope calculations. In 2045, that would be about 28 million vehicles there, you know, in 2045. But you still see, even in 2045 on this, that there's still, because of the turnover effect, there still is some internal combustion engine vehicles in the road. Like we talked earlier, people could probably buy some from out of state. They could just hang on to their cars. They could, you know, stockpile them in advance of this, you know, regulation. So, you know, I think there's some press stories which are just seeing this at the highest level. Are they going to come and take my car away, kind of thing? And so,
of course, there's always that reaction. And yes, I am deeply interested in sort of the enforcement, because there will be, no matter what the final rules are, there will be sort of gray market sales. And I'm curious, Dean, you know, so all of this will be the result of several of these programs that we've talked about in composite, because they all each address a different segment of the vehicle market. But also, just like the Zev mandate isn't really about you have to sell X vehicles, it's you have to amass a certain number of credits. I'm curious if this ends up becoming something that is sort of net zero, that yes, there will be EVs and hydrogen vehicles and hopefully plug-in hybrids and potentially other near zero emission renewable fuels and things like that, that it becomes net a zero emission program that isn't really the same as banning everything that has gasoline from dealer lots.
Yeah, I'm personally thinking that's where this is probably going to head, is that the regulatory process will result in plug-in hybrids being eligible, at least, ones with a really strong capabilities. CARB in the past on some of their incentive programs has kicked out of the HOV lane access some of the plug-in hybrids with lower miles range. So similarly, they might do something like that here. And you talk about net zero. One of the interesting things with plug-in hybrids is give a hypothetical. Say you're up at 90% of your miles are electrified, and your last 10% of miles are using an advanced next generation biofuel, which is also zero emission as far as that. And because you don't have essentially any NOx emissions due to high power cold starts or any of these things, you're essentially there. You're equivalent, or very, very close equivalent to a battery EV. So that's an example of giving flexibility to the auto community and truck community to tell them what to do and not how much. But then you open another can of worms. Is there enough biofuels? Is there enough supply out there? What's the best use of that? Should it go into bioplastics, bioelectricity, biojet fuel, bioship fuel? There's a lot of things that are probably even more important than putting it into a car.
Right.
But there's a recent report CARB put out with E3 that gets into this, and there's a lot of uncertainty. People don't know what's going to happen because there's so many variables regarding biofuels. A lot of the studies out there don't include things like algae or other surprising wild cards, like how would people end up using switching from beef to chicken? You'd be amazed how much additional biofuel such a simple change like that can result in.
Yeah.
So it's not there's just tons of uncertainty on that. And,
but I'm wondering too, like even more creatively, and I'm not taking a position on whether these things should happen, but as I imagine all of the various tugs of war that will happen, and considering things like LCFS and other kind of publicly murky credit programs, and Dean did a great webinar on that a couple months ago now. We'll post a link in the show notes. But I'm wondering if, someone's going to propose, for example, Toyota gets to sell the gasoline only Prius for another few years as long as they sink a bunch of money into public charging infrastructure. If there ends up being sort of non-vehicular ways to earn credit toward this in order to have near-term flexibility, because I can see all of those arguments happening. And while CARB's purview is mainly vehicles, CEC gets more involved in infrastructure. And CARB is the main agency that will be tasked with this, but not the only potential one that could be involved in the mosaic of programs that make this happen.
If you read that's a good side note, if you read the executive order, they do task the California Public Utilities Commission, California Energy Commission, Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, some of the jobs agencies. There's like a full employment act for all of them in there to deal with a lot of the other issues. Chelsea mentions low carbon fuel standard. CARB doesn't just have these mandates in their quiver. They're using a combination of many things, including incentives like HOV lane access, the incentive programs for trucks and cars and buses and other things. CEC has money. In fact, a lot of businesses are moving to California because it has so much money to throw at all stages of the development here. And certainly other countries are going down this path. CARB has a very interesting report I was just looking at, comparing all the different nations. How much do they have mandates? Do they have incentives? What are they using? Norway's famous for just using enormous incentives to get enormous adoption rates.
But they have a very different tax scheme that works there, but is not adoptable here.
Right. So, there's a whole mix of tools out there, and every country is using a different, kind of combination of tools. But, one reason China has done so well is they do have both, incentives as well as a pretty aggressive, mandate out there.
Yeah. So another thing that I've gotten asked a lot in the last week is sort of the implications for other areas, because there are a number of states that, when they're called Section 177 states, that adopt some or all of California's related policies to this, the Zev Mandate, et cetera. So on one hand, just because California announces this ban doesn't inherently mean that, you know, New York, New Jersey, and all the other 177 states also do this, but it sort of seems that by proxy, some of them will end up with similar results by virtue of adopting the programs that become the building blocks for this announcement.
Remember, this announcement doesn't have any enforceability. You have to have the CARB do the rulemaking, which we talked about earlier, by the end of 2021. That rulemaking then would impact all the other states that are called the 177 states that are part of it. There's over about a dozen of them. And there's some more that are working on trying to be added to that program. However, those states could opt out. They could say, no, we don't want to do this anymore, is the other option that they could have. They don't have a lot of ability really to do any tweaks to the program. It's kind of an all or nothing type decision that they have. But I could see some states deciding that this is, you know, too much. I could see.
Maybe, although that's not the trend we've seen in the last couple of years. It's gone the opposite direction. Yes, it will be very interesting to see. What have you not seen get talked about in all of this? What is everybody missing? Because you always have 18 things. Every time we talk, you're like, you didn't think of this, this, and this, which is always the best part of the conversation. Okay, maybe that did put you on the spot too much.
Yeah, it did put me on the spot there.
No, but I love that he has notes he's checking. I mean,
I am checking my notes.
That's impressive.
Dean always has notes, yes. Well, I guess, so if something occurs, great. But in the meantime, so we have these various processes. Right now we're in advanced clean cars. There will now be many more in the run up to 2021 and all of this sort of getting more finalized in the next few years. Since we have a mix of sort of individual advocates and some industry people and various folks that are crazy enough to watch this with us, what advice would you give to someone that has an opinion on this or wants to weigh in or wants to encourage flexibility or any of the above?
CARB is doing these workshops, so you might want to go, you know, Google Advanced Clean Cars 2 and see, you know, when the next workshop is. They're might be interesting to look at the details of that. They haven't gotten into this thing that Chelsea and I have been talking about, a credit system yet. That's going to be coming up in a future one. So they also have what is called an informal comment period. So you can provide comments almost any way by sending them into staff. I think they're leaning towards starting to post all those comments. Once eventually it goes to the board, it's called a 45-day package, or what sometimes is called the initial statement of reasons or staff report. It has a bunch of different wonky names. That happens 45 days before the big adoption hearing, which is probably going to be in December of 2021. And then that becomes the very formal process where if you send in a comment letter, CARB then has to respond to everything that you put into that more formal comment letter that would be in that October 2021 timeframe. So there's a lot of opportunity to comment between now, you know, and then on all of this. The other, you know, wonderful thing in the executive order, there's some important buzzwords, I thought, which was it has to be technologically feasible and cost effective. And that's a pretty broad term.
Yeah.
You know, that's one of the most powerful things in the California Clean Air Act, which says, you know, CARB can regulate almost anything, you know, as long as it's technologically feasible and cost effective. And it gives them enormous power, and they've grown to become a very large agency. Somebody told me recently they're up to like 3,000 people, so they have enormous bandwidth to get into all kinds of these issues. But this technologically feasible and cost effective will probably be a big thing. And the other thing we haven't talked about is lawsuits. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, a lot of different industries start, you know, bringing in the lawyers and trying to do that. The other thing we haven't talked about is waiver. You know, CARB has to get a waiver from the US EPA on these programs. And so, you know, that depends a lot on who is president of the United States. So that, you know, frankly, somebody like Biden would probably give them the waiver, and somebody like President Trump would probably not. So,
yeah, although even though that conversation has happened before, it's likely to end up being a Supreme Court kind of conversation, and that too may go very differently now than it would have a year or two ago. But yes, there's that aspect too, that obviously there have been lawsuits in the mandate before, and there are likely to be again. I think the technologically feasible and cost effective are going to end up being the most momentous words in the entire document, that there will be a lot of conversation and lobbying and potentially shenanigans, if we're all honest, based on those words alone. But yes, there will be a bit of a tug of war that may very well take a few years to play out. So as much as everyone's kind of freaking out today, they're going to take my truck, the likelihood is that this is going to play out until and after the moment whatever it is actually ends up taking effect. Just as we started, 30 years of a Zev mandate to get to an equivalent 9.5% or wherever we are now. It's literally taken 30 years to reach the original goal that the Zev mandate set out in 1994, 2003. So 17 years later, 17 years later, we're hitting it. And all of this, will end up being that kind of stuff as well, in my opinion.
This kind of takes me back to what I was saying on What Drives Us when we talked about this executive order last week, which was, there was some pushback on the panel about let the market decide, let customers decide what's going on and all that. And it really comes down to the fact that the market and the manufacturers never lead, almost never lead. Whether it's safety features or other things, it really tends to have to come from a push, like a regulatory push, or even if you look at it from a positive perspective, offering them credits if they do the right thing, quote unquote. And
in fairness, this is a unique topic. The EV portion, plug-in portion of this is a unique topic in that, yes, there have been various versions of external policy at play. CARB obviously started off very strong. There were also years when CARB wasn't really all that active on actually encouraging this. The mandate still existed, but it got watered down quite a bit, sort of the who killed days, in which the center of political gravity went to DC and then came back again. And so, yes, we are very externally dependent, and policy, both carrot and stick, is really, really important. But the market has actually always led on this topic more than it's been given credit for. It has been the individual advocates and people writing to automakers going, I want an EV, and making movies or whatever it is, generally trying to pull this along and encouraging CARB and showing up and live tweeting CARB meetings to the point where even after a while, Mary Nichols finally said, yeah, we know people are watching us. Like, we should not dismiss the fact that that has had an effect on the Air Resources Board as well, that the notion that this is now getting more attention and has for several years. So it is everybody kind of pulling the industry along. But at the same time, we have to, the market can't buy what's not available. And as much as I'd like that California is going in this direction, I still say that if California really wanted to be feisty, it would only allow nationwide programs to qualify for these sorts of credits and incentives and things. That it's not right that the federal tax credit has been disproportionately applied to California compared to everywhere else. And there's a lot of states where you can barely buy an EV. So people can't buy what's not available and what they don't know about, to say nothing of affordability and used cars and all of the other sub conversations. So there is a tug of war, rightfully so.
Maybe 50% of the EVs are, depends on the year, 45–50% of the EVs are coming to California.
Right.
But we're only like 12–13% of the population. So we are getting this disproportionate share. And one of the big complaints in the middle of the country and the East Coast is that there's not enough models available, sometimes 10 or 15 models compared to like 45 or 50, out here in California.
Right. Yeah. And obviously the federal tax credit should only apply to nationwide vehicles, but California is in a really unique position that it could be kind of feisty on these fronts if it wanted to. So yes, obviously they would look after Californians, and that's great. But there is an opportunity here for a larger impact with a bit of tweaking, or even to ensure all CARB states get vehicles, even if they don't take the immediate leap to nationwide. But some of those sorts of policy characteristics need to be considered as well. That availability is our single biggest stumbling block here.
On that topic of availability, one thing that we haven't talked about is still a little surprising is that what's called the Class 2A vehicles. They're most all trucks and vans and SUVs. And there's in California like close to 7 million of them. Yet their number of products in the electric sector is very, very few. You know, their
Yes.
market share is much less than 1%. So it's where the Class 1 vehicles, you know, are getting up at, you know, in most parts of California, you know, 8 to 10%, maybe not in some of the rural areas. Yeah, and those are maybe, you know, 20 million vehicles. There's this other type of vehicle that has very few. So it'd be interesting to see what CARB does to try to encourage
To goose that.
more vehicles in that category.
Yeah, I mean, even Volkswagen in their recent ID4 unveiling was very clear that they picked this sort of small crossover segment, sort of the RAV4, the Tiguan, CRV segment, which are no longer the tiny vehicles they used to be, because there's 4 million of them. And it's a decent sized space to try to electrify. And so there is starting to be some of that segmentation towards, all right, where's our low-hanging fruit?
There's another thing you said, Russell, is that made me think about the startups. The startups have a big, I think, role to play in all of this and pushing the market. Chelsea was talking about the activist community, but the startups have really, you know, Tesla is the obvious one, but we're starting to see a lot more traction from a whole lot of other, you know, startups. You know, not only do they generate credits that the big legacy automakers can buy, but they gather enormous amounts of free press and attention and, you know, education in this area, and start pushing, you know, the automakers. I mean, the luxury segment, when it started getting captured to a large degree by Tesla, certainly helped wake up the German automakers and some of the other luxury automakers as well.
Well, and to be clear, when I say advocates and activists, I don't just mean like the individual people buying cars. I mean the ones ensconced in companies as well, whether startups or larger car companies. I mean, we would not have many of the programs we have were it not for those people inside some other company trying to nudge their people along.
Yeah, I remember Bob Stempel, you know, who was the CEO of General Motors. You know, he actually lost his job when he wouldn't fire tons of, you know, engineers and stuff. This is going back to like the early 90s.
Right.
And he would show up at all the EV conferences for more than a decade. And he became head of a battery company called Ovonix and stuff. He was super interesting and approachable person. So that's a classic example of somebody that was, you know, inside a company making a huge, you know, difference.
Right.
For a long time.
Yes. Yeah, and every company has some. Some of them are, you know, sometimes more favored than others, but they're always there. And, you know, drawing out those happy warriors has been a lot of the more recent term mission.
It was something that Chelsea specializes in. Most of us don't have that ability to.
Conspiracy is really fun.
I worked through more normal, you know, regulatory channels, put it that way.
These things are not mutually exclusive. I mean, it's not conspiracy for good. It's not, you know, nefarious.
We're definitely all wearing white hats.
There's a lot of people think that everything that happens at a corporate entity happens in a boardroom with scientists and figures, and there's a spreadsheet, and somebody looks and they calculate and they go, this is the wise decision to make. When it's been my experience that, much more than most of the time, it's one champion that has a little bit more influence than the other people and says, the hell with it, this is the way we're going.
Right.
And it's those people, those leaders, those influencers that, you know, that are really important, that have an outweighed, you know, ability to make these calls.
Right. And some, I mean, we had Dave Patterson on a while back, who are, you know, not necessarily in a huge position of power at the time, but interested and passionate and persistent enough to just keep nudging the ball up the hill in his own company. So yeah, there's lots of them. You were one, Dean, for decades. You just,
you don't have to be the top person in a company to have an impact on a lot of these things.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And to network with the other people. I mean, we're used to big decisions being made on golf courses among executives, but we talk about, you know, the happy warriors networking a bit, and it's like, ooh, it's bad conspiracy. No, it's the same stuff. Just a different set of people, and not conceding that because we're not always in the position of power that we can't get something done.
You know, it also happens a lot at an agency. People don't realize that a lot of these, a lot of the decisions, maybe 90% are made at the staff level, and the board is not, in any agency, is not going to be that willing to challenge their staff, very much, or they'd have to have a really good reason to go after that. So there can be these champions within some of the agencies as well.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and they spend a lot more time steeped in it than many board members who are trying to cover all of the topics within the purview of the agency, and so therefore don't have the luxury of steeping in all of them equally.
Well, agencies or any sort of political, any municipal, state, regulatory people, any place where they can get heard, where they can be heard, and they can have an influence, if not directly guide the way they want to go. Sure.
Yes, absolutely. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and playing in the treehouse. We will flip open the flap door for you anytime.
Okay, thank you for having me.
I know you're not so much a social media guy or anything. Is there anything you'd like to recommend or promote or suggest, or anything you're working on you want to talk about?
Well, soon we're going to have a really cool website up for the Strong Plug-in Hybrid Coalition, so I encourage people to go to that at some point.
Yes. Of course, you're saying that because it's my job. But yes, yes, we will.
Oh, I see. That was one of those influential nudges. Yeah.
So each of you got to make me blush today. That was good times.
It's a sport. Everyone engages in it. Well, Dean, thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a fascinating hour, and I've learned a lot. Hopefully, maybe we'll have you back on again sometime as this develops. I would love that. Absolutely. So thanks very much for watching and or listening to this episode of Transport Treehouse. We'll see you next time, whenever that is. I like to leave it mysterious and enigmatic, It's not same bat time, same bat channel. It's just next time. Anyway.
We're feeling it.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Do subscribe and do recommend and suggest Transport Treehouse to your friends if you enjoy the show. We appreciate your support, and all of you people out there are the reason we do this. So thanks. We'll see you again very soon, next time in the Treehouse.
Thank you.